The battlefield was still smoking when Silas Fletcher found her. He had not come looking for survivors. He had come because his mule had wandered off the road after the cannon fire spooked her, and tracking the stubborn animal had taken him across a ridge he had no business crossing, down into a shallow valley that still smelled of black powder and iron, and the terrible copper-sweet stench of blood soaking into frozen earth. He was a trapper by trade, 31 years old, and weathered enough to know that smart men did not linger near fresh killing grounds, and yet something made him stop at the tree line and look out across the carnage below. The valley was littered with bodies. Hundreds of them, stretched across frost-hardened ground that was dark and glistening in the gray afternoon light. Most of them were orc warriors. He could tell from the armor, the painted skins, the great axes still clutched in green-gray hands. But there were human soldiers too, Thornwall border regulars by the look of their coats, and they were scattered among the fallen orcs in that terrible democratic way that death had of equalizing everything. Silas counted maybe 30 human bodies. He lost count of the orcs, and then one of the orcs moved. She was standing near the center of the valley, perhaps 200 yards from where he stood at the tree line. She was upright barely, one massive hand pressed against her side, the other hanging loose at her hip. She had no weapon that he could see. She was simply standing there among all those dead, her head lifted, looking at the sky the way a person looks at the sky when they are trying to remember how to breathe. Silas stood very still for a long moment. He had grown up on the frontier. He knew what orcs were, or rather, he knew what people said they were. He had heard every story, the raids on the Kellic settlements, the burning of Duskwood trading post, the massacre at Arrow Creek that his own uncle had barely survived. He had been raised to fear them, to respect them the way you respected a wildfire or a rockslide, as something powerful and indifferent and not particularly interested in whether you lived or died. But the orc standing in the middle of that valley did not look like a wildfire. She looked like someone who had outlasted something terrible and was not entirely sure what to do with the fact that she was still alive. Silas took one step out of the tree line, then stopped. Every instinct he had told him to turn around, find his mule, and ride back to Hardstone Crossing before the light failed. He was not a soldier. He was not a healer. He was a trapper with a pack on his back and a long knife on his belt, and no business involving himself in whatever had happened in this valley. He watched her legs buckle. She caught herself on one knee, head dropping, dark hair spilling forward in a tangled mass. She pressed both hands to the ground, and even from 200 yards away Silas could see the tremor that ran through her broad shoulders. He was already walking toward her before he made the decision to do it. The ground was treacherous underfoot, frozen mud, patches of ice, bodies he had to step around or over, trying not to look too closely at any of them. The wind came down through the valley in cold gusts that tasted like snow, and the light was already starting to go amber and thin at the edges, the way it did in late autumn when the sun gave up early. He kept his hands visible and his pace steady, the way you moved around an animal that might bolt or might bite, and he kept his eyes on her. She heard him coming when he was maybe 50 yards out. Her head snapped up, and she turned to look at him over her shoulder with eyes that were the color of dark amber, not the reddish-brown eyes the stories always described, but something warmer, like firelight behind smoked glass. Her face was striking. High, broad cheekbones, a strong jaw, a full mouth, and the characteristic light green-gray skin of her people, though her coloring was darker than he had expected, almost the shade of sage in shadow. Her lower canine teeth were slightly prominent, the way orc teeth were, but not the grotesque tusks the broadsheets always drew. Her features were fierce and symmetrical, and he realized with some surprise, beautiful in the way that wild things were sometimes beautiful, not soft, not decorative, but alive with a kind of raw, honest power. She was wearing armor, or what remained of it. A fitted leather bodice that had once been lacquered dark red, now cracked and scored with blade marks, laced tight over a deep burgundy blouse that had been shredded at one shoulder. Fitted leather riding trousers were tucked into heavy knee boots that had survived the battle better than the rest of her kit, and around her hips was a wide war belt hung with loops and hooks that had once held weapons, most of them empty now. The bodice was form-fitted to her frame, cinched and shaped to move with her, and despite the damage it had taken it still held, still kept her together, the way good leather armor was supposed to. She was also bleeding heavily from somewhere on her left side beneath the bodice. Silas stopped about 20 feet away and raised both hands palm out. "I am not armed," he said, which was not quite true since the knife was right there on his belt, but what he meant was that he was not pointing anything at her. "I am not a soldier. I am just passing through." She looked at him. Her amber eyes moved over him slowly, reading him the way experienced warriors read people, cataloging threat and intent and capability with the kind of efficiency that only came from years of survival. She did not speak. "You are hurt," he said. She said nothing. "I have supplies," he said. "In my pack, bandaging, herbs." "I am not going to hurt you." The silence stretched between them. The wind moved through the valley, rattling loose equipment, stirring hair and cloaks on the dead. A crow called somewhere distant, then went quiet. "I do not need your help," she said. Her voice surprised him. It was lower than he expected, rougher, with the guttural undertone common to orc speech, but her common was clear and unaccented in a way that suggested she had spoken it for a long time. "All right," Silas said, and he did not move. She watched him, he watched her. "You are still standing there," she said. "I am," he agreed. "Because you are bleeding out standing up and it seems a waste." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite humor, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized the absurdity of the moment. She looked down at her side, then back at him, and the arm she had been holding stiffly away from her body drooped a little, and he saw fresh blood well between her fingers. "I am Silas Fletcher," he said. "I trap, I trade, I am going north to Hardstone Crossing." Another silence. "Durgash," she said finally. "Durgash Bonecrusher." He nodded, as though that was that, and then he very carefully swung his pack off his shoulder and crouched down in the mud and blood of the valley floor to open it up and find his medical supplies, keeping his movements slow and deliberate and visible the whole time. She did not run. She did not attack him. She stood there and bled while he sorted through his kit, and when he stood up and walked toward her with bandaging cloth and a small clay pot of drawing salve, she held very still and watched him with those amber eyes and said nothing at all. He had to help her unfasten the left side of the bodice to get at the wound, a deep cut from a blade that had found the gap between the lacquered panels, long and ugly but not as deep as it could have been. She had lost a significant amount of blood. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound with spirits from his flask. She hissed at that, the first involuntary sound she had made, and packing it with salve before wrapping the bandaging as tight as he dared. She watched his hands the entire time. "You have done this before," she said. "Trapping is not always safe," he said. "You are not afraid of me." He considered that for a moment, finishing the last wrap and tying it off. "I am somewhat afraid of you," he said honestly. "But you are hurt and you are the last one standing in this valley, and that tells me more about you than what you are afraid of." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What does it tell you?" "That you are harder to kill than most," he said, "and smart enough to still be standing rather than lying down to die. Both are things I can work with." He stood and stepped back to give her space, and that was when he noticed how violently she was shivering. The temperature had been dropping all afternoon, and the exertion of the battle followed by the blood loss had stripped whatever warmth she had left. He watched her jaw tighten against the shaking, watched her lock it down the way a proud person locked things down when they did not want to show weakness, and without particularly thinking about it, he shrugged out of his heavy canvas and wool-lined frontier coat and held it out to her. She stared at it. "You will freeze before you reach the tree line," he said. "I am orc," she said, as though that settled it. "And I have seen orc warriors die of cold just as surely as human ones," he said. "Take the coat." A long pause. The wind pushed hard through the valley, carrying the first small needles of sleet, and Durgash Bonecrusher looked at the coat in his outstretched hand with an expression that was complicated and guarded, and something else underneath that he couldn't quite name. She took the coat. She pulled it on over her damaged armor, and it was not made for someone of her height and breadth. She stood a full head taller than him and her shoulders were considerably wider. But she worked her arms into it, and it covered her down to mid-thigh, and Silas ignored the cold that immediately began biting through his wool shirt and said, "There is a farmstead about 2 miles north, the Alderson place. They winter over. We can get you inside before dark." She said, "unless you have somewhere better to be." She looked back at the valley, at the hundreds of dead, at the particular cluster near the center where Silas suspected her own warband had fallen. Something moved across her face that he chose not to examine too closely because it was private and profound and not for him to see. She looked at it for a long moment and then she turned back to him and said, "Lead." He led. They moved through the tree line and up the ridge as the sleet thickened into the first real suggestion of snow, Silas finding the trail by instinct and the particular way the land folded here, which he knew well from years of running trap lines in these hills. Durgash walked behind him, not speaking, but he could hear her breathing controlled and steady despite everything, a discipline that impressed him. She did not complain about the cold or the terrain, or the wound that he could see was still seeping through the bandaging with every hard step. She simply walked. His mule Patience had found her way back to the trail while he was in the valley, standing exactly where she always stood when she got tired of running away from things, at the first stream crossing, with her reins caught on a low branch. She looked at Durgash when they arrived and blew a long, suspicious breath through her nose. "She bites," Silas told Durgash, untangling the reins. "So do I," Durgash said. He laughed. It startled him how quickly it came out, genuine and easy, and he saw something flicker in her amber eyes, surprise, maybe, or the beginning of something warmer that she wasn't ready to let him see yet. He loaded the pack back onto Patience and they walked on. The snow came in earnest as the light failed, soft and thick, covering the world in a merciful white silence, and Silas found himself walking close enough to Durgash that their shoulders were almost touching, both of them leaning into the warmth of proximity on instinct alone. The Alderson farmstead appeared out of the snow like a memory, the long low lines of the main house, the stable, the smoke from the chimney that meant warmth and food. Silas saw lamplight in the window and felt the relief of it deep in his chest. Old Marin Alderson answered the door. She was 60-something, with the particular toughness of frontier women who had survived everything the land could throw at them, and she looked at Silas and then past him at Durgash, and her face went through several things very quickly. Silas stepped forward. "She is wounded," he said. "She is not a threat. We need shelter for the night." Marin's jaw was tight. "Silas Fletcher," she said, "you have lost your entire mind." "Probably," he agreed. "But she is bleeding and it is below freezing and there is nowhere else for 2 miles. Please, Marin." Marin Alderson looked at Durgash for a long moment. Durgash looked back at her without flinching, without begging, with a dignity that was so complete it almost hurt to watch. "Stable," Marin said finally. "I will bring blankets and food. She does not come inside the house." "The stable is fine," Silas said, before Durgash could respond to that. They settled in the stable, which was warm with the body heat of 2 horses and a pair of goats and smelled of hay and the good clean animal smell that Silas had always found comforting. He built a small fire in the stone brazier that Alderson kept in the corner for cold lambing nights, and Marin came out with blankets and a pot of thick bean stew and a lantern and said nothing, only looked at Durgash again with that complicated expression, and then went back inside. Silas gave Durgash the stew first. She took it without ceremony and ate with the focused intensity of someone who had not eaten since before the battle, which had probably been yesterday at the earliest. He watched her from across the small fire, eating his own portion, and thought about how surreal this was, sitting in a stranger's stable with an orc warrior wrapped in his coat, both of them alive and warm when by all rights neither of them needed to be anywhere near this valley on a night like this. "You were the last one," he said after a while. In the valley, all your warband was down. She did not look up from the stew. Yes. I am sorry, he said. Silence. The fire crackled. One of the horses shifted. They were good fighters, she said finally. They deserved better ground. What happened? She was quiet for so long he thought she was not going to answer. Then the Thornwall regulars had a second company behind the ridge. We did not know. They came around the flank while we were already committed. She paused. It was not a battle, it was a trap. I am sorry, he said again, because there was nothing else to say. She looked at him then directly with those amber eyes that caught the firelight and held it. You keep saying that, she said, because I keep meaning it. Another long silence, but this one felt different. Less like wariness and more like something being weighed. The coat, she said. You will want it back. Keep it tonight, he said. I have extra layers in the pack. She looked down at the coat, his coat, oversized on her broad frame but pulled close around her. The deep green canvas darkened with her blood on the left side. She ran one thumb along the collar in a gesture so small and unguarded that he was not sure she knew she was doing it. Why? She asked. Not about the coat specifically, about all of it. He thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. Because you were standing, he said. After all of that, you were still standing. That seemed like something worth walking toward. She looked at him for a long time. Then she lay down on the hay with the coat pulled around her and closed her eyes, and Silas sat by the fire until he was sure she was asleep, and then he lay down on his own blanket and listened to the snow falling outside, and thought that tomorrow was going to be complicated in ways he could not fully anticipate, and he was not as troubled by that as he probably should have been. She was still there in the morning. He had half expected her to be gone before first light. He had expected her pride to reassert itself in the dark hours and send her back out into the snow and the wilderness alone, because that seemed like the kind of thing someone named Durgash Bonecrusher would do. But she was there, asleep on the hay with her dark hair spread around her and her long body curled under his coat, and she was so still in sleep that he stood there for a moment before he could see her breathing. She woke up when he started building up the brazier fire. Her amber eyes opened immediately, fully alert, the way people who had spent years in war camps woke up, no gradual surfacing, no confusion, just instant awareness and assessment. She looked at him, then at the stable around them, then at the thin gray light coming through the gaps in the wood, and she sat up slowly with a small, controlled sound that was the only indication she gave that the wound was hurting her considerably. How bad is it? He asked. Manageable, she said. He knew what that meant. He crossed to her and crouched beside her and said, Let me look. She held very still while he checked the bandaging. The wound had stopped seeping, which was good, but the flesh around it was warm in a way that was not entirely good, and when he repacked it with the remaining salve she bore it without a sound, only the slight deepening of her breath giving her away. You need rest, he said, actual rest, days of it. I need to move, she said. Where? She did not answer that immediately. He watched her process something, grief maybe, or the particular calculation of someone who has just lost their entire warband and is trying to figure out what that means for their future. My clan's winter ground is north, she said, in the Keth Hills. That is 4 days' hard walk in good weather, Silas said. In this snow, with that wound, it is probably 6. Maybe more. Then I had better start. Or, Silas said, you could come with me to Hardstone Crossing first, which is 1 day's walk, where there is a healer who knows what she is doing with wounds that are starting to go hot. She looked at him with those steady amber eyes. A human town. Yes. They will not welcome me. Probably not, he agreed. But I know the healer and I know the town well enough to get you through it without a problem. She studied him. He had the sense she was trying to find the angle, the profit in this, the reason a human trapper would walk an orc warrior into a human border town and vouch for her. He held her gaze and let her look as long as she needed because there was nothing in his face to hide. Why do you keep helping me? She asked. I already told you, he said. Tell me again. Because you were standing, he said, and because I had the coat to spare. Something happened to her expression. Something small and almost invisible, a softening around the eyes, a slight shift of the jaw gone almost before it was there. She looked away from him at the wall of the stable and said, "One day to Hardstone Crossing." "One day," he confirmed. "And then I go north." "Then you go north," he agreed, and did not examine too closely why the thought settled in his chest with the weight of something he was not ready to name. They left the Alderson place at first light, after Silas had left a fair payment in coin on Marin's doorstep, and a note that he hoped adequately expressed his gratitude. Marin herself watched them go from her kitchen window, and when Silas looked back, he saw her face in the frost-edged glass, unreadable. The road to Hardstone Crossing was a single track through mixed pine and birch forest that climbed and fell with the terrain in that exhausting frontier way, never quite flat for more than 20 yards at a time. Patience carried the pack, and some of Durgash's recovered weapons, a short sword and a belt knife that they had retrieved from the valley in the gray pre-dawn, the only two that had not been irreparably damaged in the fighting. Durgash wore them strapped to her body over his coat, which she was still wearing, and which he had not asked for back. They did not speak much for the first hour. The snow had stopped overnight and the world was very white and very quiet, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional complaint from Patience, who had opinions about the cold. Then Durgash said, without preamble, "Your family. They are in Hardstone Crossing." "No," Silas said. "I do not have much of what you would call a family anymore. My mother died 8 years ago, my father before that. I have a cabin north of Hardstone where I winter. I run trap lines fall through spring, sell the furs at the crossing market." She absorbed this. "Alone, generally," she seemed to consider this. "That is a lonely way to live." "It is," he agreed easily without self-pity. "But it is mine." She was quiet again. Then, "My mother's sister is in the winter camp in the Keth Hills. And some of the older warriors who were too aged for this campaign. Children," she paused, "I have to tell them. About the battle, about all of them, all of the warband." A pause. 23 people. "I knew all of them." He looked at her profile as they walked. The morning light was coming through the birch trees in pale slanted shafts, and it caught the planes of her face and the dark mass of her hair, and he thought again, with the slightly dazed quality of something true and unexpected, that she was beautiful in a way that stopped him mid-thought and required him to recollect himself. "I am sorry," he said, for the third time. "You say that a great deal," she said, but her voice had a different quality to it now. Softer somehow. "I have a great deal to be sorry about," he said, "on behalf of things I did not personally do, but that were done by people who look like me." The silence that followed was long. Then, the trap, the second company behind the ridge, was that a common tactic? For the Thornwall regulars, he considered it. More recently, yes, they have a new commander, Barras. He is effective and thorough and completely without scruple about how he wins. He paused. "I do not like him." "Have you met him?" "Once. He came through a trading post where I was buying supplies. He looked at everything like it was a resource to be processed." Silas watched his boots. "Including the people." Durgash was quiet for a long while. Then she said, "Your people and mine have been fighting for 40 years. About that. Do you know why, officially?" "Land rights along the Keth border. The Aldenmore treaties that the Crown signed and then ignored when the land turned out to have iron in it." He glanced at her. "Unofficially, because it is easier to keep fighting than to sit down across a table and treat each other like people." She looked at him sidelong. Her amber eyes were thoughtful. "You have thought about this?" "I live on the border," he said. "You cannot live on the border and not think about it unless you work very hard at being stupid." She made a sound. It took him a moment to recognize it as something close to a laugh, low and almost inaudible, but there. Hardstone Crossing announced itself first by smell, wood smoke, and tannery, and the particular yeasty warmth of the grain mill at its eastern edge, and then by sound, the distant clang of the smithy, the creak of wagon wheels on the frozen main track. Silas felt Durgash tense beside him as the first buildings came into view, log and stone structures strung along a central street that was busy in the mid-morning commerce of a frontier trading town. "Stay close," he said quietly. "Head up." Do not reach for your weapons regardless of what anyone says. I know how to conduct myself in a human town, she said, and there was an edge to it that he respected. I know you do, he said. I am reminding myself as much as you. They walked into Hardstone Crossing together. The reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. Conversation stopped. A woman loading a wagon near the tannery went very still. Two men on the smithy steps straightened up and their hands moved toward things at their belts. A child who had been running along the boardwalk saw Durgash and stopped so fast she sat down hard in the snow, then scrambled to her feet and ran inside. Silas kept walking at the same pace, Patience's lead rope in one hand, and he turned his head neither left nor right, just kept his eyes on the healer's sign 3/4 of the way up the street. A dried herb bundle hung above a blue-painted door. They almost made it. A man stepped off the porch of the Crossed Axes Tavern into the middle of the street about 50 feet from the healer's door. His name was Denton Harg, and he was one of those men the frontier produced with some regularity, big, self-certain, with a face made permanently florid by cold and whiskey, and the particular kind of bravery that came from being surrounded by people who were watching. "Fletcher," he said. "What in the hell are you bringing into this town?" Silas stopped. He felt Durgash stop beside him. "A wounded person who needs a healer," Silas said, keeping his voice mild. "Same as anyone." "That is not a person," Harg said, and his voice carried, and Silas saw men coming off the porch behind him, 3 of them, all with the same posture of grievance looking for direction. "She is exactly a person," Silas said. "And she is not looking for trouble. Step aside, Denton." "There were orc raiders hit the Kellick farmstead 2 weeks ago," Harg said. "Burned the grain store, took 2 horses. You are walking one right through our street." "I am walking an injured woman to a healer," Silas said. "She has been nowhere near the Kellick farm. She was in the valley south of Ravenridge Ridge yesterday, where she lost her entire warband to a Thornwall ambush." He kept his voice even and clear, loud enough to carry to the people gathering now on both sides of the street. "She is not a raider. She is wounded and she needs care. And anyone who wants to make this into something it is not can come talk to me about it after she is seen to." He stood there in the street, with Durgash at his shoulder and Patience's lead rope in his hand, and maybe 20 Hardstone Crossing residents watching from various vantage points, and he looked at Denton Harg with a calm that he had to work to maintain because his heart was hammering. Then he turned to Durgash and said, "Come on," and walked the last 50 feet to the healer's blue door. He heard Harg start to say something else behind them and then stop, and he did not know if it was because someone restrained him or because some residual instinct toward decency prevailed, and he did not look back to find out. The healer, Petra Wynne, was a compact, no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s who had seen enough of the frontier to have opinions calibrated by evidence rather than prejudice. She was startled to see Durgash, clearly, but she recovered quickly and let them inside and looked at the wound with the dispassionate efficiency of a professional. And her assessment was the same as Silas's, well-bandaged. Early signs of infection, needed proper treatment and rest. 3 days, Petra said, addressing Durgash directly, which Silas appreciated. Minimum. The heat in the wound will get worse before it gets better. If you push through that in cold weather with exertion, you will be looking at fever, and fever this far from a proper town will kill you as surely as the blade. Durgash sat on Petra's treatment table with the coat folded in her lap and looked at the healer with a measuring expression. 3 days, she repeated. At least, Petra said. Ideally 5. Durgash looked at Silas. He spread his hands. I have a cabin, he said. North edge of town, it is not much. But it is warm and it is quiet and it is out of everyone's way. People saw me come in, Durgash said. People see things in Hardstone Crossing every day, he said. Most of them forget by supper. Harg will not forget. Harg forgets everything by the 3rd drink, Petra said crisply, and Durgash looked at her with a flicker of genuine surprise, as though she had not expected the healer to take a position. Petra met her gaze steadily. I have been sewing people back together on this frontier for 30 years, the older woman said. Orc and human alike. Wounds look the same on everyone. You need rest and treatment, and I do not have the time to be squeamish about who deserves it." Something happened to Durgash's face. It was very small and very guarded, but Silas caught it, a softening around the eyes, a slight drop in the shoulders, the smallest release of attention she had been holding so long she had probably forgotten it was there. "All right," she said quietly. 3 days. Silas's cabin sat at the north end of Hardstone Crossing's loose sprawl of buildings, set back from the main track with a cleared yard and a small lean-to stable, and enough distance from the nearest neighbor that conversations inside did not carry. He had built it himself 8 years ago, the winter after his mother died, when he needed something to put his hands to, and it showed the particular quality of something built with grief as fuel, solid, functional, without a single wasted joint or gap. He brought Durgash there in the early afternoon, while most of Hardstone was occupied with its midday business, and he built up the hearth fire and set water to heat, and showed her the sleeping loft with its thick fur blankets without any particular ceremony, the way you showed a person things they needed to know. She looked around the cabin slowly. It was one main room with the hearth on the south wall, a worktable along the west side cluttered with trapping equipment in various states of repair, shelves stacked with dried food and trade goods, his rifle hanging above the door, and the steep ladder that led up to the loft. She looked at all of it with the same measuring thoroughness she applied to everything, and then she said, "It is a good cabin. It keeps the cold out," he said. "That is the main thing." She sat in the chair by the hearth, the good chair, the one with the back and the arms, not the three-legged stool he usually used himself, and pulled the coat around her again. And Silas pretended not to notice the way she settled into it, the way her hand moved over the worn collar again in that small private way. Petra came at dusk with her kit and proper medicines and spent an hour on the wound, and Durgash bore all of it in silence, and when Petra left she said, "She will mend well if she rests." This to Silas, but loudly enough that Durgash could hear from the loft where she had retreated. "Keep her warm and keep her still." "I will try," Silas said. "You might have less luck than you think," Petra said, with a dry look, and let herself out. Silas slept by the hearth that first night, on his own bedroll with his own blankets, giving Durgash the loft entirely. He lay in the dark and listened to the fire settle and the wind outside, and above him he could hear, very faintly, the sound of her breathing, slow and even, and he thought about the valley and the smoke still rising from the cold ground and the single figure standing among all that death, and he felt something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration and was becoming, he suspected, something else entirely. On the second day she was restless. He could tell because she came down from the loft before he was properly awake, and he found her standing at the worktable looking at his trapping equipment, with the intent focus of someone who needed something to do with their hands. He made coffee, the real kind, from a small precious bag he saved for cold mornings, and put a cup on the table near her without comment, and she looked at it, and then at him, and then picked it up. They spent the morning in a companionable quiet that surprised him with its ease. He worked on his equipment, checking springs, mending lines, re-waterproofing his pack, and she watched, then asked a question about the mechanism of one of the larger traps, and he explained it, and she listened with complete attention and asked 2 follow-up questions that were precise and intelligent, and he found himself talking to her about trapping the way he rarely talked to anyone, with full engagement. Not performing an explanation, but actually sharing something he knew well with someone who was genuinely interested. She told him, in return, about the Keth Hills in winter. The way the elk move through the mountain passes in heavy snow, always the same routes, year after year, and how the orc hunters tracked them on wide-set snowshoes, and how the pelts were cured and traded with the valley settlements below the tree line in exchanges that had been ongoing for generations before the wars started. She talked about it with the quiet authority of someone who had grown up inside that knowledge, and Silas listened, and the morning went by. By midday, the tension had eased from her face enough that he could see what it looked like without the weight of it. She was younger than he had initially thought, 26. She told him, when he asked directly, which meant she had been a warrior for years but was not ancient, not worn down to stone the way the veteran fighters sometimes were. She had a particular quality of attention that was disarming, the way she focused entirely on whatever was in front of her, giving it her complete presence without distraction or performance. He had met very few people like that. On the third evening, she asked if she could clean her short sword. He found her oil and cloth and a whetstone, and she worked at the kitchen table while he cooked a venison stew from the stores in the root cellar, and the sound of the whetstone against the blade was a steady rhythm underlying the domestic quiet of the cabin, and it was so unexpectedly peaceful that he had to focus on the stew to avoid examining it too directly. "Tell me about your family," she said, while he stirred. He told her. His father, who had been a trapper before him, and had died of a fever when Silas was 19, leaving him the trade and the territory and the knowledge. His mother, who had kept a small farm east of Hardstone and had the kind of stubborn competence that made the frontier survivable, who had died of something gradual and internal that no one in Hardstone had the knowledge to treat. No siblings, no wife, a handful of close acquaintances, and the comfortable solitude of the trap lines. "You chose solitude," she said. "It was not a question." "I chose a life that fit me," he said. "Solitude was part of it." "Did you never want," she paused, as though deciding whether to finish the question. "Want what?" "Someone, a household, what your people call family." He was quiet for a moment, ladling the stew into 2 bowls. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "More lately." He brought the bowls to the table and sat across from her, and she had set the sword aside, and she looked at him across the candlelight with her amber eyes that caught the flame and held it, and the directness of her gaze was something he was still getting used to, the way it seemed to go right through the surface of a person and find whatever was actually there. "What about you?" he asked. She looked at the table. "In my clan, there are partnerships. Practical arrangements mostly for households and children. I had been expected to form one with a warrior named Gorak." A pause. "He was in the valley." "I am sorry," he said. "It was not that kind of arrangement," she said carefully. "I cared for him. He was a good fighter and an honest person. But it was not." She stopped. "Not what?" She looked up at him. The candlelight moved between them. "Not this," she said, and then seemed to realize what she had said and looked back down at the table, and a silence fell that was charged with something neither of them was ready to name yet. He found things for her to do on the 4th and 5th days because he could see it was keeping the grief at bay, and she was not the kind of person who processed things by sitting still and feeling them. She processed things by doing. She repaired several of his lines with a precision that improved on his own work. She sharpened every blade in the cabin. She organized the roof cellar by a system that made significantly more sense than his previous arrangement, and explained the logic of it to him while she worked, and he listened and nodded and thought that she had one of the finest minds he had ever encountered, in an orc or a human, in anyone. He caught himself looking at her constantly. Not in a way that was obvious. He was careful about that, careful not to make her feel watched or assessed, given everything she had survived, but in the way that people look at something they cannot quite stop looking at, something that has moved into their peripheral vision and become necessary to it. The way she moved, the economy and surety of it, the strength that was simply present in her body without performance. The expressions that crossed her face when she was thinking, a slight furrow between her strong brows, a tightening of the jaw. The way she laughed, low and almost surprised, when something genuinely struck her as funny, as though she had not quite expected to still be capable of it. On the 5th evening he was at the worktable restitching a section of his pack when he heard her breath change. He looked up and found her standing at the small window that faced north, both hands flat against the sill, looking out at the dark. "You are thinking about the Keth Hills," he said. "I am thinking about 23 people whose families do not know yet," she said. Her voice was level, but something in it was not. He set down the pack. He crossed the room. He stood beside her at the window, looking out at the same darkness she was looking at, the vast quiet dark of the frontier night, and he said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and he had learned over a lifetime of solitude that presence was sometimes the whole thing, the entire offering. She stood very still for a long time. Then she said, "I was supposed to lead them." "You did lead them," he said. "Into a trap. Into a battle that was more than it appeared to be," he said carefully. "You were flanked by a second company you had no way to know was there. That is not your failure. They are still dead." "Yes," he said, and did not argue with that because it was true and she deserved the truth, not comfort that was really just noise. She put her head down between her outstretched arms, braced against the windowsill, and he heard something in her breath that was very controlled and very costly, and he did something he had not let himself do before. He put his hand on her back between her shoulder blades, just resting there, warm and steady, not demanding anything. She went very still under his hand, like an animal that has tensed against an expected harm and then discovers the touch is gentle. He kept his hand there. After a long moment she straightened. She did not step away from him. They were very close, close enough that he could see the texture of her skin in the lamplight, the faint green in the gray of it, the small marks along her jaw that were not scars but the natural patterning of her people. Her amber eyes were bright. "Silas," she said, his name in her voice, the low, rough music of it, just that. "I know," he said, though neither of them was quite sure what he meant, and maybe that was all right. She left the next morning as planned. He walked with her to the north edge of town in the early gray before anyone was much about, and Patience trotted along beside them because the mule had apparently decided Durgash was worth following, which Silas thought demonstrated good judgment. He had packed her a supply bag, 3 days of food, a small first aid kit, the whetstone she had used on his blades, and a folded piece of oilcloth that would keep a bedroll dry in the snow. He handed it over and she looked at it, and then at him. "This is too much," she said. "It is exactly enough," he said. "The wound is still healing, take it slow on the first day." She took the bag, she was still wearing his coat. "The coat," she said. "Keep it," he said. "It fits you better than it fits me anyway." She looked at him for a long time. The morning light was the soft, tentative light of early winter, and it turned the world gentle and provisional, and she stood in it with his coat around her shoulders and her dark hair loose and her amber eyes steady on his face, and he thought with sudden, precise clarity that he was not going to stop thinking about this person for a very long time. "I will return north in spring," he said. "My trade route runs past the Keth Hills when the pass is clear. The trading post at Dunmore is 2 days below your winter ground." "I know Dunmore," she said. "I will be there in late spring," he said. "If you wanted to," he stopped, started again. "If you had news about your people, I would like to hear it." Her expression was careful and very aware. "Late spring," she said. "When the snow clears the passes," he said. She nodded once and shouldered the pack and turned north, and Patience actually made a small sound of protest, a short, indignant bray, and Durgash looked back at the mule and said, very softly, something in Orcish that Silas did not understand, and then she walked away up the north track, and the birch trees closed around her and she was gone. Silas stood in the road for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he went back to his cabin and spent the winter in it, alone with his work and the long, cold nights, and the particular persistent thought of amber eyes in firelight. He left for the northern trap lines in late March, when the ice was breaking up and the forest was beginning that urgent, muddy, magnificent transformation toward spring. He ran his lines, sold his furs at the various posts and settlements along the route, and pushed north through the Keth foothills with an energy and purpose that he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge had less to do with trade and more to do with a woman he had met in a valley full of the dead. Dunmore Trading Post sat at the junction of 2 mountain tracks, a cluster of low buildings around a main trading hall that smelled of beeswax and dried herbs and the particular musty richness of stored furs. The proprietor was a wide, cheerful man named Oscar Fenn, who had been trading with orc clans and human settlements alike for 20 years, and regarded them with the same useful impartiality as currency. Silas arrived in the first week of real spring warmth, when the passes were clear enough for travel, but the mud was still deep enough to be a problem, and he was 3 days into a comfortable arrangement with Oscar's trading post, helping with some structural repairs in exchange for room and board, while he waited to see if his instinct about late spring at Dunmore was good, when he heard the mule making noise in the stable. He went out to see, and Durgash Bonecrusher was standing in the stable yard. She was travel-worn and mud-streaked, and she was still wearing his coat, and she looked at him across the yard with those amber eyes, and something happened to her face that she did not quite manage to suppress in time. Relief, he thought, and something more than relief, something he recognized because it was happening in his own chest at the same moment. "You are here," she said. "I said I would be," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "My aunt's household, in the winter camp. They received the news. They are—" She paused, looked away, gathered herself. "They are grieving, but they are alive. The clan survived the winter. Children are fed. The hunting was good in the hills." "That is good," he said. "All of that is good." "Yes," she looked back at him. "I told them about you." That surprised him. "Did you?" "I told them a human trapper with a bad mule helped me survive." She paused. "My aunt wanted to know if you were honorable." "What did you tell her?" Something moved through her face that was warm and complicated. "I told her you were the most honorable person I had met in a long time," she said. "Orc or human." He was quiet for a moment, holding that. Then, "How long can you stay?" She tilted her head. "How long can you?" "As long as there is reason to," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Then perhaps we should find out how many reasons there are." He smiled. He could not help it. And she looked at his smile. He thought perhaps she had not seen him actually, fully smile before, and something in her expression did something that could only be described as opening, like a door that had been held careful and closed, finally swinging on its hinge. Oscar Fenn, who noticed everything that happened on his property, and had the discretion of a man who depended on the goodwill of all parties, provided Durgash a room without comment, and set an extra place at the communal table without ceremony, and the two of them spent a week at Dunmore that Silas thought about for years afterward. They talked, with the particular urgency of people who have spent months with words saved up and no one to give them to. They talked about the war and the border treaties and what the Keth Hills looked like in deep summer and what it was like to run trap lines in the first hard frost. They talked about what the frontier looked like from above, from the mountain passes, and what it looked like from below, from the valley floors where battles happened. They talked about grief, and about what endurance cost, and about what small things sustained you when large things failed. On the third day, he taught her to play a card game he had learned from a river trader years ago, and she beat him soundly on her fourth hand, and looked at him across the cards with a satisfied expression that was so genuinely delighted, he burst out laughing. On the fifth day they took Patience up into the hills above Dunmore, following a track that Silas used for his spring trap lines, and the world was doing its glorious spring thing, everything green and urgent and smelling of wet earth and new growth, the snow only at the highest elevations now, the light clean and long. Durgash walked beside the mule with her hand resting easy on Patience's neck, and she was easier in her body than she had been in the winter, the grief still there, but settled beneath the surface rather than pressing up against everything. They came to a high point on the track where the trees opened, and the whole of the Keth foothills spread below them, ridge after ridge going blue and hazy to the north, and Durgash stopped and looked out at it with the expression of someone looking at home. "There," she said, pointing to a particular line of peaks, "between those two ridges, that is where the winter camp is." He looked where she was pointing, and then he looked at her looking at it, and the afternoon light was on her face and the wind moved her hair, and he thought he had never in his life wanted to say something quite as much as he wanted to say something right now, and that perhaps this was as good a moment as any. "Durgash," he said. She looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, getting it right in his head. "I spent all winter thinking about you," he said. I want to be honest about that." She went very still. "I do not know what the right way to say this is," he continued. "We come from different places and different people, and I know the world is going to make this complicated regardless of what we choose, but I would rather have the complication than not have you in it." The silence stretched between them with the mountain wind in it and the whole of the Keth frontier spread below, and Durgash looked at him with her amber eyes very steady and very bright and said, "I spent all winter thinking about you too." He let out a breath. "What do we do with that?" she asked. Not dismissively, but genuinely, with the practical quality she brought to everything. "Here is a thing. What do we do with it?" "I would like to keep finding out," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she stepped toward him, closing the distance between them to a foot to less, and she put her hand against his jaw, her palm warm and broad and careful, and she looked at him the way she had been looking at him all week, with that direct, complete attention, and she said, "I am willing." He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm. Just that. Warm and deliberate and honest. He felt her breath change. Then he raised his head and looked at her, and she tilted her head down to meet him. And the first kiss was quiet and unhurried, a thing that arrived not in a rush of urgency, but with the steady inevitability of something that had been true for months and was only now being said aloud. Her mouth was warm, and the mountain wind moved around them, and Patience made a small, indignant sound at being ignored. And when they pulled back from each other, Durgash was looking at him with an expression he thought he would remember for the rest of his life: wonder, slightly undone, as though she had not quite expected it to be like this. "That mule," she said, "has the worst timing." He laughed and she laughed, and the sound of it went out over the Keth foothills into the spring air, and it was, he thought, one of the best sounds he had ever heard. He asked her on the last night at Dunmore what she planned to do. Her warband was gone. The clan's fighting strength was reduced. The war was ongoing in fits and starts along the border, but the Thornwall regulars had taken losses at the valley too, and there was a fragile, unnamed ceasefire of mutual exhaustion in the immediate territory. "I want to go back to the winter camp," she said, "to my aunt, to the children." She paused. "To help rebuild what was lost. The clan needs hunters more than warriors right now." And after, she looked at him across the fire. They were in Oscar's common room, alone, the hour late and the post quiet around them. "I do not know what after looks like," she said. "I never expected a world where after was something I was thinking about." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "My trade route runs north every spring and south every fall," he said. "Dunmore is a stop either way," and he paused, thinking it through. "There is land east of Hardstone Crossing. Unclaimed homestead land along the Kettrell Creek Valley. A person could build on it." She looked at him carefully. "I am not saying anything definitive," he said. "I am saying that after, when you are ready to think about it, there are options, and I would like to be one of the options." Her amber eyes were very warm in the firelight. "You would homestead," she said. "You, who chose solitude." "I chose a life that fit me," he said. "I am reconsidering what fits." She reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her fingers laced through his, and she held his hand and looked at it, her large, strong hand wrapped around his, and then looked back up at his face, and the expression on hers was something he had not seen before, open and careful and something like hope. "Ask me again," she said. "In the autumn." "I will," he said. And he meant it. He spent the summer running his lines, making more than the usual detour through the Keth foothills, and twice he stopped near enough to the winter camp that messages could be exchanged. Durgash sent him a bundle of dried herbs that the orc healers used, and that Petra Wynne in Hardstone examined with great professional interest, and he sent back a good skinning knife with a new handle he had fitted himself. Small tangible things traveling in each direction, the language of people who trusted objects to say what words could not yet quite manage. They met at Dunmore again in early autumn, when the aspens were going gold, and the first real cold was coming down from the peaks. She was there when he arrived, sitting on the fence of Oscar's corral with her legs hanging and her face turned up to the pale autumn sun, and when she heard Patience's particular complaining bray, she looked over and saw him and smiled a full, unguarded smile that transformed her whole face. And he thought, yes, all right, there is everything. This time they stayed at Dunmore for 2 weeks. It was different now than the spring had been. Easier and deeper and more particular. They had the vocabulary of time and correspondence, and understood each other's habits and rhythms in the way that only came from attention. She had been busy through the summer rebuilding the clan's hunting organization, working with the elders to negotiate the terms of their continued occupation of the Keth Hills territory with the nearest human settlements, which had been delicate and exhausting work that she described with careful precision while he listened. He had been busy, too, securing a new trade arrangement at the southern posts, repairing and expanding his cabin, applying quietly to the territorial land office in Hardstone about the homestead claim along Kettrell Creek. He told her about the Kettrell Creek land on the 5th evening, sitting outside on the trading post steps with cups of Oscar's cider, watching the stars appear over the mountains. The claim went through, he said. Officially mine. 40 acres along the creek, mixed timber and open ground, good water, soil that would take a garden. She was quiet for a long moment. I looked at it in the summer, he said. The cabin site would be east-facing, good morning light. He paused. Good enough for 2. She looked at him. The stars were coming out one by one above the mountain line, the thin, clear stars of high country autumn. Silas, she said. I know, he said. There are 20 things that make it complicated. The town, the border politics, your clan's expectations, my complete ignorance of what your formal customs require. You have thought about all of these. I have thought about very little else, he said honestly. She set down her cider cup and turned to face him fully on the step, pulling one knee up, regarding him with that complete attention. In my clan, she said slowly, a formal partnership requires the approval of the senior household. My aunt is the senior household now since my mother is gone. What does the approval look like, he asked. A meeting, she said. A conversation, her judgment, she paused. She is fair. I would like to meet her, he said, if that is the right next step. Durgash was quiet for a long time. The night deepened around them, cold and crystalline, the mountain silence settling. Then she said, it is a hard journey in autumn. The passes are, I have good boots, he said. She looked at him. And a mule, he said. Something shifted in her expression. That opening he had seen on the hilltop in spring, wider now, more certain, as though she had been waiting to find out if he meant what he said and was finding out that he did. You would go to the winter camp, she said, into the heart of my people's territory, for this. For you, he said simply. The silence after that was very full. Then Durgash Bonecrusher leaned forward and kissed him, not with the quiet, careful quality of the first kiss on the hilltop, but with something more direct and more certain, her hand coming up to his jaw again, and he kissed her back with all the months of patient waiting in it, and the stars kept appearing overhead, cold and brilliant and indifferent to anything so small as 2 people finally, fully, saying yes to something. The journey to the Keth Hills winter camp took 4 days, with Patience carrying the supply pack and Durgash setting the trail with the surety of someone who had walked these mountains her whole life. Silas kept up without complaint, which he could see pleased her in the small way she had of registering approval, a slight nod, a brief direct glance. The mountains were tremendous, and the cold was significant, and the passes were exactly as difficult as she had implied, and he thought, managing the last steep section with his lungs burning and his legs aching, that he had never been happier in his life. The winter camp appeared through the trees on the afternoon of the 4th day. A settlement of orc-hide tents and low stone and timber structures arranged in a functional cluster at the base of a protected ridge, smoke rising from multiple hearth fires, the smell of cooking meat and wood smoke carrying on the wind. He heard voices, children's voices, and the particular deep tones of orc conversation, and then someone at the camp perimeter saw them coming, and there was a brief commotion as the news spread. By the time they reached the outer ring of the camp, there were people watching. Orc men and women of various ages, warriors and hunters, elders and young adults, and children who peered from behind their parents' legs with enormous dark eyes. They looked at Silas with a wariness that was the precise mirror image of the wariness the human settlers had shown Durgash when he walked her into Hardstone Crossing, and he held himself the same way he had held himself then, head level, hands visible, pace unhurried, and he let Durgash do the speaking. She spoke in Orcish. He could not follow it, but he could read the room as she talked, the tension in the watching faces, the expressions that shifted from wariness to something more complicated, the elder women in particular, who listened with the serious attention of people who were weighing something important. One of them, a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s with Durgash's same strong jaw and amber eyes, only darker, more worn, watched him with a gaze so thorough he felt it like a physical thing. Durgash said his name. He heard it clearly in the Orcish, Silas Fletcher. She said something else. The older woman, her aunt, he understood, looked at him sharply. Then Durgash said to him in common, "My aunt asks, why do you come into our territory?" He looked at the older woman directly and answered honestly. "Because your niece is the finest person I have met in my life," he said, "and I want to do this properly." Durgash translated. Her aunt listened, then said something back. "She asks," Durgash said, "what you offer." "My trade," Silas said. "My land along Ketrel Creek. My honesty and my work in whatever years I have." He paused. "And I would learn your customs if you would teach me. I do not think it should only go one direction." Durgash translated this. The camp was very quiet. He was aware of every set of eyes on him, and he kept his gaze on the aunt, who was watching him with the same fierce assessing quality that Durgash had, and he thought they must have learned it from the same source. The aunt said something that lasted for a while, a measured, considered statement that the watching camp seemed to receive with the attention of something formal. Durgash translated. She says, "My niece has carried grief enough for 10 warriors. She has earned the right to choose her own path. If she chooses you, the clan will watch and judge by what she brings back from that choice." A pause. "And she says," Durgash's voice changed, became slightly uneven. "She says that my mother would have wanted this for me, to have someone at my side who chose to walk into the mountains for me." He looked at Durgash. She was looking at her aunt with an expression that was luminous with something he recognized as the specific emotion of being truly seen by someone who loves you. He looked at the aunt. He put his right fist to his chest, the orc gesture of respect that Durgash had taught him on the trail up, thinking ahead, and he inclined his head. The aunt looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a sound that was, he felt fairly sure, a grunt of acknowledgement that bordered on approval, and the tension in the watching camp shifted perceptibly, not to warmth exactly, not yet, but to something more open, more willing to be convinced. They stayed in the camp for 4 days. Silas worked. He was not someone who knew how to be useless, and he helped with the tasks the camp needed. Firewood, the repair of a storage structure, the processing of a recent hunt's yield, work he knew well in its broad principles even if the specifics were different. He worked alongside the orc hunters and warriors without speaking much, since they had little common between them, and his Orcish extended to perhaps 15 words, but work was a language of its own, and he spoke it fluently. And by the 3rd day, there were men making space for him at the fire ring with something like easy inclusion. The children were fascinated by him. A girl of perhaps 8 with Durgash's coloring kept appearing near him while he worked, at progressively shorter distances, until on the 3rd afternoon she simply sat down beside him where he was splitting kindling and watched him work with enormous, interested eyes. He handed her a piece of split wood, and she examined it gravely, and then handed it back, and he split another piece and added it to the pile, and they sat in this companionable way for the better part of an hour without either of them saying anything. Durgash found him like that, and stood at the edge of the firewood pile with her arms crossed, and her expression, one of such naked warmth that he had to look away and focus very hard on the next piece of wood. On their last night in the camp, Durgash's aunt hosted a meal. The whole household gathered, which was perhaps 12 people, aunts, cousins, elders, the children, and there was food and something warm and fermented that tasted like smoky honey, and that Silas drank 2 careful cups of. Durgash sat beside him at the low table and translated selectively the conversations that were addressed to him, or that he would want to know about, and he could feel the shape of the evening settling into something important, something that would be remembered. After the meal, when the children were asleep and the elders had gone to their tents, Durgash and Silas sat alone by the main fire, and he reached into his pack and brought out the thing he had been carrying since Hardstone Crossing, wrapped in a square of cloth. He held it out to her. She took it and unwrapped it. Inside was a small carved figure, a mule in dark wood, very precisely detailed, the particular stubborn head and heavy body of Patience, rendered with a care that had taken him most of the summer's evenings. He had learned the carving from his father, who had made small animals for his mother throughout their marriage. Durgash looked at it for a long time. Her thumb moved over the small carved mule, the same way it had moved over his coat collar in the stable in the Alderson farmstead, that unconscious private gesture. When she looked up, her eyes were very bright. "You made this," she said. "Over the summer," he said. "I was thinking about you." She looked at him. The fire was between them, and the camp was quiet, and the mountains were dark around them, and she was so beautiful it was almost too much, the planes of her face in the firelight, the amber warmth of her eyes. "I am going to ask you something," he said, formally, "if that is all right." She nodded very slightly. "Durgash Bonecrusher," he said. "Will you come south with me to Kettrell Creek? Will you build something there with me? Not the life I had before, the solitary life, the small life, but something larger, a house with morning light, a life that fits both of us, a beginning." The fire crackled. The night pressed warm around them. "Yes," she said, quietly and without hesitation and with complete certainty. He exhaled like he had been holding that breath since October. She leaned forward and he leaned forward, and they met in the middle across the fire, and the kiss was slow and deep and full of everything that had been building for over a year. And when they drew back, she was holding the carved mule in one hand and the front of his shirt in the other, and she said, against his mouth, "You absolute disaster of a man." "Is that good?" he asked. "It is the best thing I have ever been offered," she said. They left the Keth Hills with the aunt's blessing, a formal thing, spoken over them both at first light, with the whole household present, and Silas stood through it with his fist pressed to his chest, and tried to hold the weight of it with the solemnity it deserved, and thought that whatever he did not understand about it, he understood in the way that mattered, which was the way you understood rain, not by analysis, but by how it felt on your skin. Patience was deeply pleased to see Durgash again, and demonstrated this by immediately attempting to eat her sleeve, which Durgash bore with patience of her own. They went south. The cabin at Kettrell Creek was not built yet. It was 40 acres of mixed forest and creek flat and open meadow ground, with a good site identified, and a foundation planned but nothing raised. And they arrived in late autumn, with the first serious cold coming, and the understanding that they had perhaps 3 weeks before the ground froze hard enough to make building impossible until spring. Silas had brought materials on a hired wagon from Hardstone Timber, hardware, roofing supplies, and they set to work with the particular urgency of people who understood what was at stake. They built the cabin together. Silas had built before and knew what he was doing with timber and post and beam, and Durgash, who had been building orc structures since childhood. A different tradition, but built on the same fundamental principles of load and shelter, and weather, adapted quickly, and brought an efficiency to the process that shortened the work considerably. They worked from first light to last, and by the end of the second week they had 4 walls and a roof and a hearth that drew properly, and they stood back and looked at it in the evening light, and Durgash said, "It is good," with a satisfaction in her voice that he felt in his own chest, like something settling into place. The winter they spent in that cabin was the best winter of Silas Fletcher's life. They were snowed in for much of January and February, cut off from Hardstone crossing for weeks at a time, and it was not a hardship. It was everything he had not known he wanted, the daily company of a person who was brilliant and sometimes difficult and always honest, who challenged his thinking and shared his silence with equal comfort, who worked as hard as he did and rested with the same full commitment. He learned 20 more words of Orcish. She taught him the Orc system of tracking by the behavior of trees as much as by trail signs, a method that was more reliable in the deep winter than anything he had been using. He taught her his trap line routes. She reorganized the route cellar again, and this time he helped and they argued amiably about the logic of it, and ended up with a system that incorporated both their approaches and was superior to either. He loved her in the full, specific, daily way that was nothing like the grand gesture and everything like the choice made again and again. The cup of coffee made the way she liked it, with the extra measure of grounds and a piece of dried fruit crumbled in that she had learned from her mother. The extra log on the fire when he heard her breath deepen toward sleep. The evenings when she was working through her grief about the warband, which still came in waves, quiet and internal, and he learned to recognize it and to be near without pressing, a warmth in her peripheral vision. The first night they came together as more than proximity and want. It was deep in February, when the storm had been blowing for 3 days and the cabin was tight and warm against it. They had been sitting by the fire, Silas reading aloud from a battered geography book he had salvaged from a trader years ago, Durgash listening with her eyes closed and her head tipped back against the chair. And he had reached the end of a passage and looked over at her and found her watching him with an expression that was so openly warm he lost his place entirely. She crossed to him and he set the book down, and she took his face in both her hands with a tenderness that stopped his breath. And what followed was slow and careful and full of the weight of everything they were to each other. All the months and the miles, and the trust built up piece by careful piece. He held her like something he had been afraid of losing long before he had known he could have her, and she held him with the whole of her considerable strength made entirely gentle. And the storm went on outside, and the fire burned down to coals, and everything was exactly as warm and true as it had been building toward being. He woke in the deep dark of the winter night with her breath against his shoulder and her arm across him, and he lay very still and looked at the ceiling of the cabin he had built with her hands alongside his, and he thought that this was the life he had not known he was missing the whole time he was living the smaller one. Spring came the way it always did on the frontier, grudgingly, and then all at once, the snow giving way to mud, and the mud giving way to the explosive green urgency of the world insisting on itself. Silas went to Hardstone Crossing to register the homestead claim formally and buy spring supplies, and Durgash went with him. It was the first time she had been back since that initial walk through the main street with his hand steady at her back. The reception was different this time. Not warm frontier towns did not go warm on a schedule of your choosing, but quieter, the active hostility replaced by something more like uncertain watching. Harg was still at the tavern. He looked at Durgash when they came in for supplies and said nothing, and Silas thought that was enough for now. Petra Wynne came out of her blue-doored surgery and took Durgash by both hands and said, "You look considerably better than the last time I saw you," and meant it as medicine. And Durgash looked at the healer with that warmth that was so particular to people who had been genuinely kind to her, and said, "I have had good care." They bought the supplies they needed and left the same day, and on the way back out the main track a woman Silas vaguely knew, Elsa Vander, who kept a vegetable garden and sold at the weekly market, stopped them and looked at Durgash and said, uncertainly, "I heard you helped build the Kettrell Creek homestead." "I did," Durgash said. Elsa Vander looked at her hands. "I need a storage barn put up before summer," she said. "I cannot afford the mill's rate for the work." A silence. "I do not know your prices," she added helplessly. Durgash looked at her for a moment with those steady amber eyes, reading her the way she read everything for truth and intent and the thing underneath the words. Then she said, "I would need to see the site and good materials." "I have materials," Elsa said. "Good lumber from the Keswick mill." "Then come to Ketrel Creek on a clear day," Durgash said. "We will talk about it." Elsa Vander nodded and ducked her head and went back to her garden, and Silas looked at Durgash as they walked on, and she said, without looking at him, "Do not." "I was not going to say anything," he said. "You were thinking it very loudly," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. The Vander barn went up in June, and Silas and Durgash did the work together, and Elsa fed them at midday and thanked them with the direct, spare gratitude of frontier people who did not perform their feelings but put them into action. 2 other households in the Hardstone area came that summer with similar requests, and Silas and Durgash did the work because they needed the income, and because the work was good, and because each small completed thing was another conversation between Durgash and the human world that had once closed its doors to her. Harg said something ugly at the market in July. Silas heard it from 30 feet away, loud enough to be intended, a dismissive reference to what Silas was living with. And Silas set down the bag of grain he was loading and crossed the market square with the particular deliberate calm that was more alarming than anger. And he stood in front of Harg and said, in a clear and reasonable voice, "Say it again." Harg looked at him and did not say it again, and Silas went back to the grain, and Durgash, who had watched this from beside the wagon, said nothing. But when he climbed up beside her on the wagon seat, she took his hand briefly, and that was sufficient. That autumn Durgash went back to the Keth Hills to visit her aunt and spend time with the clan, and she was gone for 6 weeks. Silas ran his trap lines and came home to the Ketrel Creek cabin each evening, and thought about the fact that his definition of home had shifted entirely without him noticing exactly when it happened. She came back with her hair braided in the elaborate clan style she wore for formal occasions, and a new leather vest her aunt had made for her, fitted over the familiar deep burgundy blouse, and she walked across the yard toward him with the carved mule in one hand. She carried it everywhere now, he had discovered, and he went down the porch steps and met her in the middle of the yard and held her for a long time without either of them saying anything. "I thought about something," she said, into the side of his neck. "Tell me," he said. "The clan's territory in the Keth Hills, the access tracks to the lower settlements are old and badly maintained. They were built for the campaigns. Now the hunters need to use them for trade, and they are wrong for it." She pulled back enough to look at him. "You know this country better than anyone I have met, and you know the human trade routes south." He understood where this was going. "You want to renegotiate the access." "I want to build something that does not need renegotiating every 3 years," she said. "A formal route, agreed by both the Keth clan elders and the Hardstone Settlement Council, marked, maintained, and permanent." He looked at her. "It would take someone who can talk to both sides," she said, "who both sides will actually listen to." "That is you," he said, "and possibly me." "Both of us," she said. "Yes." He thought about it. He thought about Petra Wynne, who could be an ally. He thought about Oscar Finn at Dunmore, who had been trading both sides for 20 years and would understand the value. He thought about the land office in Hardstone and the territorial council, which was fractious but not stupid. "It will take time," he said, "and it will make some people very angry." "I know," she said. "Are you ready for that?" She looked at him with her amber eyes, steady and warm and entirely sure. "I have been standing in difficult ground my whole life," she said. "At least this time the ground is worth standing on." He kissed her forehead. She leaned into it. "All right," he said. "Let us build something permanent." Over the next 2 years, Silas Fletcher and Durgash Bonecrusher became something the frontier border had not quite seen before, a known quantity. Not universally liked, not universally trusted, but known, and in the particular way of frontier communities that valued competence and reliability above most other things, increasingly respected. Silas's trade knowledge and his ability to navigate the human settlements gave Durgash access to conversations she would never have been invited into alone. Durgash's knowledge of the Keth clan networks and her standing among the orc hunters gave Silas access to a side of the Keth Hills territory that no human trader had reached in 20 years. They made 4 trips to the Territorial Council in Hardstone over 18 months, and they made them together, always together, Silas doing the formal speaking because that was what the council would receive from a human man, Durgash sitting beside him with every piece of information he needed, and a reading of the room that was more precise than anything he could have managed alone. The council was reluctant, then cautious, then with the addition of a well-timed endorsement from Oscar Fenn, whose trade revenues were compelling math willing. The Keth Hill Access Agreement was signed in the 3rd spring after Silas and Durgash settled Kettrell Creek, in the main hall of Hardstone Crossing's territorial office, by 3 Orc clan elders including Durgash's aunt and 2 human settlement representatives. Silas and Durgash were not the signatories. They were the architects, the messengers, the people who had stood in the middle of the hard ground and held both sides in conversation long enough for the conversation to become something. They stood outside the office afterward in the street in the ordinary morning bustle of Hardstone Crossing going about its business, and Durgash looked at him with those amber eyes that he knew now as well as his own face in a still stream and said, "It is not everything." "No," he agreed, "but it is more than there was before." "It is considerably more than there was before," he said. She looked at him. Something in her face was the same and also different from the valley, different from the figure standing alone among the dead, upright through sheer refusal to fall. Upright now for different reasons, fuller reasons. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking that I found you in the worst possible place," he said, "and it was still the best thing that ever happened to me." She looked at him for a long moment, the Hardstone street moving around them, ordinary life proceeding in all its indifferent busyness. "Silas," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you," she said. He had not expected it in those exact words, in that direct orc way that did not hedge or soften, just said the true thing, and it landed in his chest like something returning after a long absence. "I love you," he said back, simply, because that was how it was. She closed the distance between them in the middle of Hardstone Crossing's main street, and it was not lost on either of them that this was the same street where she had been walked through 2 years ago to the sound of silence and wariness and Denton Harg's ugly posture. And she kissed him, and he kissed her back. And around them the ordinary world went on, and some people looked and some people looked away. And Elsa Vander, crossing the market square with her basket, saw them and smiled into her vegetables. Their son was born the following winter. He arrived at the end of the hardest cold snap the frontier had seen in a decade, which Silas privately thought was exactly right, arriving in the hardest weather and being fine anyway, which seemed like it would probably be a theme. Petra Wynne came out to the Kettrell Creek cabin for the birth, sliding through the snow on a horse who was not delighted about it, and she was exactly what she always was, competent, unsentimental, and quietly kind. He was large for a newborn, which Petra observed with the professionally neutral tone of someone choosing her battles, and he had his mother's amber eyes and the faint green tint in his skin that would deepen as he grew, and Durgash's strong jaw, and to everyone's slightly surprised delight, his father's particular expression of intense focused curiosity, the one Silas wore when he was reading the land for a trail. They named him Silas Bonecrusher Fletcher, for the warrior she had lost and the man she had found, and Durgash held him in the firelight of the Kettrell Creek cabin and looked at Silas with an expression that he thought was the most complete thing he had ever seen on any face. "He is going to be a great deal of trouble," he said. "The best things are," she said. The aunt came down from the Keth Hills in the spring to see the baby, a journey she made in 5 days that Silas suspected she could have made in 3 if she had chosen to hurry, but that she made in 5 to mark the weight of the occasion. She sat with the baby for a long time, saying something in Orcish so quietly that Silas could not have heard it even if he had understood, and when she handed the baby back to Durgash, she looked at Silas with those dark, worn amber eyes, and said, in common that surprised him with its clarity, "You are a good man, Fletcher." "I am trying to be," he said. "That is the only answer worth giving," she said, and went in to have supper. Hardstone Crossing did not transform overnight, and they never expected it to. The prejudice did not vanish. It was too old and too deep for that. But it shifted and eroded over years, the way hard ground gave way eventually, not to one rain but to the persistence of them. Durgash became known, not safe, not entirely trusted, but known, which was the beginning of everything else. The barn she and Silas had built for Elsa Vander stood for decades, and people knew who had built it. The access agreement brought down trade goods from the Keth Hills that the Hardstone market genuinely needed, and need had its own persistent logic that worked on people when principle could not. Petra Wynne referred people to Durgash when the orc healing knowledge was relevant, and it was relevant more often than anyone had thought to wonder. And slowly, over years, there were frontier folk who had reason to be grateful for the knowledge Durgash carried, and gratitude was a better teacher than any lecture on fairness. The Kettrell Creek homestead grew, a second cabin building for storage and workroom. A proper stable that patients approved of with the enthusiasm of an animal given a dignity she felt she had always deserved. A kitchen garden that Durgash tended with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. A second child, a daughter they named Durgash Bonecrusher Fletcher, Marin for the old woman at the farmstead where they had first sheltered. A debt of warmth that Silas had never forgotten, and Jura for a word in Orcish that Durgash's aunt said meant the first warmth after a hard winter. Marin arrived in summer and had Silas's coloring lighter skin, the same brown hair, the same shape of eye, but her mother's jaw and her mother's absolute certainty. And by the time she was 3, she was conducting everyone in the household with the calm authority of someone who had always known this was her territory. Gorak grew taller than Silas by the time he was 12, with his mother's height and his father's hands, and an instinct for the land that was both of them combined. He spent his early years between the frontier homestead and the Keth Hills winter camp, equally at ease in both, which was the thing that had to start somewhere and started with him. Durgash Bonecrusher ran the homestead at Kettrell Creek with a competence that became legendary in the area, not because she performed anything, but because she simply did what needed doing with a consistency that the frontier rewarded. She negotiated the annual Keth Hills trade terms. She consulted with Petra Wynne on frontier medicine. She kept the access agreement current through 2 changes of territorial council and 1 attempted rollback by a new land commissioner named Wick, who had never met an orc he considered worth the trouble, and who, after 2 meetings with Durgash, could not quite articulate why his position had softened but had to concede that it had. Silas ran his trap lines through his 40s and gradually shifted toward trade as his territory opened up along routes that the access agreement had made viable for the first time. He became the person the territorial council consulted when they needed to understand the Orc clan perspective on a given issue, which still sometimes required him to explain that the best person to consult on the Orc clan perspective was the Orc woman he had been living with for over a decade. But he explained this patiently as many times as it needed explaining. They had 20 years at Kettrell Creek before anyone in Hardstone stopped noticing that they were something unusual. And then they had another 10 years where they were simply themselves, the Bonecrusher Fletcher household, who built good barns and ran honest trade and had 2 children who were going to leave the world slightly different from how they had found it. On the 20th anniversary of the day, he had walked into the valley after his wandering mule and found her standing among the dead. Silas came in from a late evening in the stable to find the cabin warm and lamplit and Durgash at the hearth, not working, just sitting in the good chair with a cup of something warm and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, which had gone slightly silver at the temples in a way that made her more beautiful rather than less. The carved mule sat on the mantel above the fire, as it always had, in the place of honor she had given it the first winter at Kettrell Creek. She looked up when he came in. "What?" she said, because she could read his face entirely by now, every variation of his expression, and knew he was thinking something specific. He sat down on the stool across from her and looked at her in the firelight, the amber eyes, the strong face, the person who was the whole of his home, and said, "I was thinking about a valley south of Ravenridge Ridge." Her expression changed, soft and complicated and complete. "I was thinking about a man who did not know enough to mind his own business," she said. "You needed the coat," he said. "I did not need the coat," she said. "You were shivering," he said. "I was not shivering," she said, and the corner of her mouth was moving. "Durgash," he said. "Silas," she said. "I would do it again," he said. "Every step of it." She looked at him for a long, warm, entirely certain moment. Then she reached across and took his hand in her large, strong one and held it the way she always held it, completely, without reservation, the way she did everything. "So would I," she said. Outside, the wind moved through the birch trees along Kettrell Creek, carrying the smell of the approaching season, and the fire burned low in the hearth of the cabin they had built together. And inside it were the years of work and the children growing and the life that had started in a ruined valley with a coat handed over in the cold, a small thing, and offered warmth, and had become this, enduring and particular and theirs. The frontier went on being the frontier, hard and wide and full of distance, but in this one place along a creek in the foothills of the Keth Hills, a trapper and an orc warrior had made something that lasted, and the carved mule on the mantel looked out over all of it with the patient expression of an animal who had always known, from the moment she found herself tangled in a low branch beside a valley full of the dead, that this was exactly how it was supposed to go.